Hey friends, just want to recap what we talked about last week in Bible study, looking at the life of Abram in Genesis 14 and 15. We start chapter 14, and Abram's nephew Lot's in a bit of a predicament. He had made a dubious decision to live next to some wicked neighbors, and he ends up getting captured as plunder in the midst of a raid from some foreign kings. Abram then marshals 318 fighting men from his household to help rescue Lot. After routing the invaders, Abram not only rescues Lot and his possessions, but also other plunder, people and possessions that were taken by these raiding kings. And now two kings come to Abram seeking tribute. First, we have Melchizedek, who's the king of Salem and the priest of God Most High, and also the king of Sodom. And you may remember this obscure figure, Melchizedek, from our study through the book of Hebrews. If you want to find out more about him, you can look back on my sermon, or you can look in Hebrews 5 through 7. Now, Abram recognizes that he has a spiritual kinship with Melchizedek, and after Melchizedek recognizes God as the creator and creator of heaven and earth, and credits God with the victory, Abram offers him a tenth of everything, and that's where we get the tithe from. Now remember, Melchizedek is not only a king, but he's also a priest. And so a priest would be a proper person to bring offerings to God. So now we have, in contrast, the king of Sodom. Sodom was a wicked place, but it's also clear that the king of Sodom is expecting an offering from Abram, because that's what kings expect. But Abram makes it clear that even though he drove off the enemies of Sodom, he has no interest in aligning himself with them and their wickedness. You'd think Lot might learn from this whole episode, but we'll find out later what happens to him. So now we get to chapter 15. And it might be fair to assume in this chapter that God knows that Abram needs some encouragement, as God offers these words in a vision. He says, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." That's very good and all, but Abram has some questions. Remember the whole promise of "I will make you into a great nation" from Genesis 12, and being a great nation involves having land and having descendants. Well, this doesn't seem to be happening, as Abram and Sarai are still experiencing barrenness. That's the reality that they are living in. They cannot have children. In fact, they've planned for this as Abram has set up that he would give his possessions to an heir, to a servant who will take care of them in their old age. But that's not God's plan for them. God tells Abram that he will have his own heir, that is his child, his own flesh and blood, not a servant. But notice that God doesn't say when. Beyond the words, God also invites Abram to look up at the stars, and then Abram believes God. Given the choice between his childless reality, where he's making his own plans, or God's reality, where he becomes the father of a nation, well, here he has faith and he chooses God's reality. That's what it meant to believe God. Believing God is doing what he is, believing that God is going to do what he says he's going to do. But again, the issue of timing can make it tough. That's what's made it tough on Abram so far. Now, God's plan wasn't just for descendants, as numerous as the stars. That's the example that God gives. Look up in the heavens, see all the stars, and you'll have descendants as numerous as this. But the promise is also for land. And Abram wonders how? And God responds with two grand acts. First, he gets a dream sequence for telling the Exodus episode for Israel, and also a vision that Abram will live to a good old age. And second, there's this strange ritual. This ritual involves animals cut in half and traveling in between them. But what's up with that? That's pretty weird. Well, back in ancient times, when people would make serious agreements, they did it with some flourish. And in this ritual, two people would make an agreement, and then they would walk in between the animals that they've cut in half. And this would signify how serious they were in keeping the agreement. Why is that, though? Well, it basically meant that they would say that if I break my agreement with you, may I be like these animals that have been cut in two. May I be cut in two. Yikes. You don't want to be like that. Anyways, God asks Abram to set up this ritual. But what happens? Well, Abram is deep asleep, and a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch moves through these animals alone. Now, the smoking fire pot is God's presence. The fire, the smoke, these are images that are used a lot in the Bible to depict God. So why would God move through this alone? Well, because God wants Abram to understand that God is one who keeps promises. If God made the promise, God will keep the promise. God wants Abram to know that God is serious about being a promise keeper. So these promises that God has made and keeps making to Abram, God wants Abram to know that. And finally, this is all affirmed in God making a covenant with Abram. God will keep the promise of making a nation from Abram. Abram's journey continues in chapter 16 with returning to some of the old bad behaviors, but that's what we're going to start looking at this week in Bible study, and I hope you'll join us Tuesday at 7 o'clock on Zoom.